Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the introductions and greetings to everybody that is joining us for the Hack the Capitol virtual conference. Unfortunately, I can't be there. I'm on site actually doing a security assessment right now, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to discuss with you some of the findings that we've had at Cutaway Security over the last 2 years and the lessons that we've learned during our ICS security assessments. My name's Don C. Weber. I work for Cutaway Security. We help organizations by providing security services associated with ICS security program maturity analysis, doing security assessments for their control networks. We do penetration testing, and we'll discuss the difference in just a second. And we also work closely with the ICS Village doing security research. ICS Village, because of the support from many of you, has been able to provide security researchers with guidance and also with equipment to do some of this research. So we're really happy to give back to them at any opportunity that we can. I am a certified SANS instructor. I teach the SANS ICS 410 class, which is the ICS SCADA Security Essentials, and I teach a hosted class as well, the Assessing and Exploiting Control Systems, where we talk about the methodology for assessing these types of networks. Now we are going to talk about the security assessments, and we're actually going to talk about 8 that we've done over the last 2 years, but I need to set the stage a little bit. So the first part of it is that we can't talk about our specific clients, and and some of the findings we'd have to sanitize as well. So these are still relevant. You're still going to get relevant information, but we've sanitized it a bit. This is a small set of security assessments, okay? So it's kind of like a sample set for everything that's going on out there. But what we're really happy about is that our observations are in line with other larger organizations like Dragos. So if you look at Dragos's 2020 year in the review, you're going to see similar findings. And I do encourage you to go out and look at that because they pull together their findings associated with their security assessments and their incident response efforts. And there's some enlightening observations there. We're going to talk about the issues for some of the organizations for these assessments, but just remember that they brought somebody in to help them analyze how they are right now, to help with the maturity or to understand the risks associated with specific product. So they're moving in the right direction, and I think that's important to note. And then finally, COVID is a concern for these types of things. We've seen a lot of security assessments move or be canceled because the organizations just can't support it. If either their people have been sick or they've had protocols in place that don't allow people to come in, and if you can't really do remote assessments for these types of things. You can, but it's extremely difficult because it's difficult to talk to the people and understand the process. It's also difficult to give them equipment that you can remote into because these systems are typically isolated from the internet, so it's hard to remote into them, and it's not like a corporate network where you can do that type of thing and get a security assessment done relatively quickly. So COVID has had a negative impact on security assessments for ICS environments. We do need to talk about what security assessments are for our control networks, OT security assessments, and they are the same as corporate security assessments, but there is a caveat, okay? And you can see that on the left-hand side of this slide, and that's risks to the environment, okay? Penetration testing and red teaming, I said that we talk about pen testing. We don't do a lot of that. While we do pen testing, that's a part of what we do. We don't actually do, in the 2 years of experience that we have not done an actual pen test within these environments because that means making changes to the system. And when you make changes to the system, especially when when you don't have an administrator for that control network right there, you can have a negative impact. You can turn off the processes, and you can even cause a safety issue. So we typically don't see penetration testing or red teaming going on unless it's specifically called for by some type of regulation or requirement. Okay, And that's why what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about some of the security program maturity analysis that we've done and the security assessments. And you can see that those are lower risk than penetration tests because you're gathering information from the environment, but you're not making changes to those systems that are associated with attacking the system. So our first one, in 2019, we went into a retail store's warehouse. So this is distribution sector. We were actually pulled in, we were asked to do a security assessment of a very specific product. And it had a wireless component. The information security team for this organization was worried about how if you can connect to that wireless component, take control of the process, and possibly pivot within the environment. And while that was a concern, the biggest concern that we found when we got there was that the information security team did not have a good relationship with the control network team, with the operation technology team. And they didn't have the same goals. The actual operation technology team, while they didn't try to stop us from doing the security assessment, they gave us anything that we asked for. They didn't really understand what our goals were. And when it all ended, when the security assessment ended, we realized that we weren't really evaluating the most critical things within that control process. Okay, and that's because there was poor communications between the information security teams and the OT teams. Now, this organization had a strong corporate security program. Unfortunately, they had not figured out how to tweak that for the control network, and that meant that it was kind of being ignored within their control network. But fortunately, we pointed that out and we got them moving in the right direction. The next assessment that we did in 2019 is we went into a distillery, which is the food and beverage sector. And they asked us to come in to evaluate the security program across their organization by looking at 3 different plants. And those 3 different plants, one was distillery, one was distillery and bottling, and then the last one was just bottling. And so it gave us a good understanding of the differences between the types of technologies that were implemented in those control networks and at different locations. These were in Kentucky, but they're at they're about an hour drive between them, and the teams that were there administering them were different teams. They had a central team for some things, but every site had a different team specifically dedicated to the processes at that location. Okay, and a part of the issues that we came up with was, even though it was the same organization and they had the same policies across all of those plants, there was different implementations. Actually, one plant was really good as far as the separation between the control network and the corporate network, and the others had holes between those 2 networks that allowed us to go from the control networks out into the corporate network and out to the internet and vice versa. And so that was something that they already knew about within their teams. They just needed us to point it out so that they could get leadership to provide them with guidance and resources. And I say that because the people that we were working with were the IT and the OT administrators for those processes. Okay, and when you think about that, those IT and OT administrators had security responsibilities. In other words, somebody tasked them to do security for the process. But they were already 100% tasked with keeping those processes up and running. So these were additional duties. And whenever the processes went down, or whenever there was some type of maintenance period or something like that for the process network, those duties took precedence over the security duties. And they were having a real struggle with having enough time to actually improve the security for these plants. And we, by looking at their security program and their implementation, we helped their leadership understand that. What I was really proud of this organization, I was really proud of them because my liaison that was working with me, the IT/OT administrator at this organization, I went in one day and I went in to ask him a question, and he was like, "Hey, I can't talk to you right now." He was on a conference call, and after I caught up with him about 2 hours later, he was like, I apologize about that, but there was an incident within our corporate network, and I really needed to listen to that to see if there was any risk to our process network. And what that meant to me is that the process control administrators were in tune with the corporate incident response process and actually on the phone to see if they needed to protect the control network from intruders. And I didn't see that in any other organization, but this team knew that that was important to do, and they were on top of it. So that was definitely a strength for this organization. Our first assessment in 2020 was a smart building, and we actually went in to do an analysis of a number of control networks within this building. They had electrical, they had fuel, they had the heating, air ventilation, and cooling networks, and also lighting for the building, so controlling ingress, egress, the lights and other things that were smart parts of the building. Initially they had integrated, or they had deployed all of those networks to be completely separate from each other, and that was their original intent, because they wanted to protect those networks from each other. But after the building was in use, they started realizing that they needed to have those networks connected so that everything operated in conjunction with the other network. In other words, when somebody walked into an area of the building and the lights came on, they knew that the havoc control needed to cool that area of the building. And so they had to have that communication that, hey, somebody walked into this part of the building. So they tied the networks together. And by the time we got there, because they hadn't thought of all those use cases and they hadn't limited the communications between the networks, even though they were initially deployed separate, by the time we got there, we could move to all of the networks by connecting to any one point on the network. And they didn't realize that, and we helped them understand that. But probably the most important thing about this is that we realized that they had no monitoring to understand that at all. So even if we plugged into that network, we could do our reconnaissance, identify things on the network, take ownership of things by compromising them, pivot throughout the network, and then start attacking it. And the only thing that they would notice were the results of those attacks. They wouldn't know how they did it, where we were, anything like that, because they had no monitoring. But what was great about this is that they did have that network segmentation already in place, so it was just a few modifications to improve that. They were completely isolated from the internet, which is, I haven't seen a lot of organizations doing that at all, and this organization did it really well. And then leadership. As soon as we had the findings, they sat down with us, understood the findings, and turned around and started helping helping their administrators address the issues. The next assessment in 2020, we went to do an evaluation of a substation. So we needed, this organization needed help with some asset identification, and they coupled a security assessment of their implementation along with that. And our concerns about this were that this was going to be a substation. This was a full refurbishment of a substation. So they were going to take out all of the equipment out of this low-risk substation and put all of this new equipment in there, power it up, get it running, and then it would be serving the public. Unfortunately, at least in my eyes, they didn't do any security protections. They did do their asset identification, and they did make some, have a lot of redundancy for it, so that the grid was safe. But if you actually plugged into that network, they were using default credentials across everything, even though this was a brand new system that they could have made those modifications before it went into the plant. Okay, so I was really concerned about that, and we pointed that out to them. Fortunately, they've got a security program that's addressing that. But unfortunately, because that system is going to be in place when those new policies and procedures come into place, it might be a long time before those changes are made. But even more importantly is they had no monitoring. So even if you were on that system, attacking systems or brute forcing credentials, they wouldn't know about it. They wouldn't come out to stop you unless they detected your physical intrusion on that premises. Strengths about the organization, though, is, like I said, their security program was moving forward in a positive manner, and the team was working really hard to educate themselves and augment their team by bringing outside experts in. The assessment that we did after that was associated with the battery skid, and this was the electrical sector again, and this was a security assessment of vendor implementation for a battery. And so when I talk about a battery skid, consider a trailer truck and a Connex box on top of that. Inside the Connex box are a bunch of batteries. On the outside of the Connex box are some control panels boxes with program logic controllers and cellular modems and network switches. So the infrastructure that is used to communicate and manage the batteries. And this skid is supposed to support outages in certain areas, whether it's for a building or whether it's for a neighborhood. If the power goes out or if they need to stabilize the power in that area, they would deploy this device. So it's always going to be out in the public. Physical security was a big concern about that. Some of the things, so there's a number of things that we found associated with this because we're evaluating the vendor's implementation of this in a lab. So we got to do a lot on this network. Surprising things we found was that one of the power meters had a Wi-Fi access point built into it and actually on. All we had to do is go and put an antenna on it, and I could walk into the office and communicate through the power meter and do stuff on the network. So that was an interesting finding there. And we were able to help the utility. We helped them by pointing out some of the issues, the risks, the attack surfaces that the vendor hadn't taken care of, and which allowed the utility to go back to that vendor and say, hey, how are you going to take care of this, or how are we going to reduce the risk here? Because this device is going to be connected to their network. The biggest thing that they were concerned about, though, is that it was mandatory that this battery skid be connected to the cloud. In other words, the vendor itself had to maintain, for maintenance purposes, connectivity to the battery skid. And you could do it in two ways. The first way was a cellular modem within those control cabinets, or you can set up a connection that goes through your corporate network out to the internet, and they can connect to it through that. So they needed to understand the risk associated with all the devices on here to pick the best solution associated with that. But the biggest issue in my mind is that they had no incident response plan if there was an issue detected on these devices. They didn't know how to, they hadn't tasked anybody with understanding what happened to those devices, and which could mean that when attackers are in there, they could be attacking the network, but they had no information around that, and so they wouldn't know what attackers are doing. So that was a big concern. But what the organization was doing right is they were doing a security assessment of the product before it actually went in. And kudos to them for doing that. Of course, they're going to pick this vendor. I think they had already picked this vendor, but this gave them the power to go back to that vendor and say, hey, we need these issues taken care of before we implement your product. And it also made them realize that they needed a lot of physical security for these devices since they're going to be out in the public. After that, we did another kind of utility sector-esque assessment, but this was associated with a data center microgrid. And what that means is that this data center, so a large building, multiple buildings actually, they had their own substation that was connected to the electrical grid. And their substation also had generation connected to it. And that's because they needed to be able to power their data center if the actual network went down. So if there was a brownout or a blackout, they needed their generation to kick off to protect all of their equipment. And what we were able to do is we were able to go in at the factory acceptance testing. In other words, the vendors were just deploying these systems within their own networks to demonstrate they could meet the capabilities that were requested by the client. Okay, and so the client, our client, and the client of this vendor had given them specific requirements around how they needed to provide service to that data center. How much energy they needed to provide, how fast they needed to provide it when there's a brownout, a blackout, and so forth. But what we quickly realized when we were doing the assessments, while they had requirements around the process, our client had never given that vendor any defined security requirements. They just said, make it secure. Of course, the issue there is that vendors follow your requests, your requirements for the process. They're only going to build to that. So if you don't actually give them any specific security requirements, they may not build it in, or they'll build some stuff in because they're getting a little bit better about that, but it's going to be a minimal set to reduce costs because they don't know exactly what you need. And so because the vendors didn't have any specific requirements, there were not a lot of security protections built into that. And I say that with a caveat, and that's because the vendor team, the team that was selected to do this actually did go above and beyond for our clients. They did implement security, but it wasn't anything that was pushed down by the vendor's information security team or anything like that. They just did it on their own. If our clients had gotten a different implementation team, they might not have gotten those security protections. Okay, and so that was an issue that we called out. It was a strength for the vendor, and so we identified that as well. The next assessment we did was just a quick assessment. This was actually a lot of fun. We went into help a team build a simulator for a vehicle, and so we got to learn some information about vehicle communications and some of the challenges that organizations or the teams that are doing security assessments on vehicles are having because vendors implement protocols differently, and so that was really interesting. And then the final security assessment that we did in 2020 was another electrical sector assessment, and this was actually remote. So all of our other ones were on site. This was a remote security assessment. We were looking at their security program to help them understand the maturity of their substation, unregulated substations. So they're low-risk substations that didn't need to adhere to NERC requirements. Their auditing team wanted us to help identify any issues associated with the security program for those sites. And so they sent us a lot of documentation. We reviewed that documentation, had some interviews with a few people, and then helped them identify some of the issues for their implementations. One of the issues was that all of those substations, because of the distance, they're maintained by different parts of the organizations, and so they're individually managed and maintained. And so there's some disparity associated with the implementation at different sites. And so they're strengthening that right now. The biggest issue, however, that we identified was just by reading their documentation, we identified a critical issue associated with how they were managing their Active Directory between their corporate environment and their control environment. And if you go read Dracus's reports, the leading cause of compromises within control networks are associated with the integration somehow of the association of the corporate Active Directory and the control network Active Directory. You need to have those separate. You can't have the same passwords on either of those networks, or attackers are going to use that against you. The strength for this organization, though, is that their audit team was looking for help to identify how they can improve their processes, and so we're really proud of them for that. So those are our 8 assessments over the last 2 years. Okay, and when we look back across those, we identified some of the most important things, or at least I did. Okay, the first one I talked about a little bit about this, but we're going to address it a little bit more. Vendors and integrators expect security requirements from their clients. Okay, unfortunately, the clients are expecting vendors and integrators to provide secure solutions. So it's kind of like they're doing this little dance. They're dancing around each other saying, you help me, no, you help me. And it's not getting done. And unfortunately, what that means is that as vendors are deploying these solutions for their clients, they're going in an insecure state. Everybody's getting a little bit smarter. Security's getting a little bit better at that implementation, but it's not as good as it should be. And that's because clients, this is your responsibility. So whether you're my clients or you're the vendor's clients, you need to realize if you're purchasing a control network technology or a full implementation, you need to be very specific about your security requirements. You need to define them up front, just like you define your process requirements. That's what the vendors are looking for. If you tell them that, they will implement them for you. Okay? The next issue is vendors and integrators are not providing their teams, the teams that are building the solutions for their clients, they're not providing them with security configuration guidance. Now, they're training them on the configuration settings for individual devices, but they're not sending them out with best practices for a holistic implementation of the products. How to deploy the management software and the devices and set up the network. They're not giving them all of the good basics that you can, that security baseline for those. Okay, and that really needs to change because your clients need help. They need help with that implementation. So you need to be developing those, setting up test networks, figuring out the proper security baselines and configurations for operating systems and for networks, training your teams, and providing it to your clients. The next thing is lack of communications between the OT and IT teams. Okay, and so this is when I talk about my clients, this is on them. If you're an information security team or if you're an IT that's moving over to help an IT administrator that's going over to help the process team implement those information technologies, you need to understand the process. You need to go down, before you start making recommendations about changes, you need to sit down with the team, understand the team members, talk to the process engineers and the operators, find out how the process works, understand the requirements for the process to keep it up and running, why it was built that way. Understanding all of those things first, and then start taking a look at how you can improve the security around that to ensure that the security controls that you're putting in place, the improvements that you're putting in place, are actually helping and not hindering the process. And the more you talk to those individuals, the more they'll trust you, and the more they'll be willing to listen to what you have to say. And then finally, probably the most important thing is the fact that there's not enough monitoring and incident response planning. I could have had that bullet point on every single one of their slides, meaning that there was not enough monitoring. Okay, but if you're going to gather information, your team needs to understand how they're supposed to respond to it when they see anomalous events, whether it's just something that's broken or whether it's actually bad actors within the network. They have to have a plan for how to respond. They have to have a plan for who to contact and bring in to discuss the issues. So organizations need to start planning that better. They need to start gathering the information, looking at the information, and responding to events that happen in their control networks. And that's it. I really appreciate everybody's time. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Tom is going to answer your questions if he can. If not, you can reach out to me at this contact information, whether it's Twitter, direct email, or connecting with me on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to answer your questions. Have a great day.